hello. There it is. Thank you for that. I'm going to be thinking about cheese doodles now and the orange fingers we have by sharing our favorite poems. I submitted for this Rhapsody Today by Barbara Ross, which is a poem from a book that came out in 2006, although I did not read this poem until last year. So this is not a formative poem necessarily for me, but it is a beloved poem. But I feel like I've shared my formative poems, like Jen said, and talked about my formative poems so many times that I wanted to talk about one that I've been thinking about more recently. And also I just wanted the pleasure of being able to read it and share this cheese doodle with you. Rhapsody Today. Maybe today will be the day you wake and for the first time watch the full moon set surprisingly red over the fine edge of the earth. Maybe today you'll see the fawn on its gawky legs, the spots on its side, floating tentatively like some leftover dazed grace, so that you think about animals, their paths to righteousness, and maybe you'll remember the day a dragonfly rode your shirt front all the way around the lake, its jeweled body breathless but pulsing, a little like first love. Maybe today you'll find gardenias floating in a blue wood-fired bowl, and their scent will bloom into the room like ghostly elephants bugling softly. And finally, you'll buy the tickets to Zanzibar, somewhere with slow fans and ceremonious walking, where the post office behind the soccer field will smell of cinnamon, and on the way to the coast you'll visit a village, and the king there will remind you, without evil there is no good. And though, of course, evil will enter into every day, maybe today it will be impersonal, budding into your life quietly, like the deer heads on the walls of the barbecue shack, or insidious but distant, like the human ear in a lab somewhere growing on the back of a mouse. Maybe you can put even these out of your mind along with the cruelty of strangers and imagine that today's the day a little bit of time might stop, suspended in the foot a great blue heron holds above the water. Or maybe you'll watch the mourning doves and discover they warble as they fly, so eternally amazed by flight that they call, "I'm doing it, I'm doing it." Why not make today the day you look at the back of your eyelids in a fresh way, the glitter there reminding you of the beach, the starstruck sand you sifted as a child, sometimes finding a shell the size of a large speck and wondering about the sound of the sea held in its infinitely small swirl and what kind of ear it would take to hear it. By now, maybe, it is noon, the sun squandering itself like a coin, burning a hole in the blue pocket of sky, and you think of the hours in the dead of the day in a dusty square, a colonial city somewhere in Boyaca, and you remember a burrow in a plaza the size of a classroom, you waiting for the bus, the burrow waiting for nothing, while a dust devil picked up spinning, wind and dirt dancing quietly, and you told yourself, remember this, the burrow, the dust, and you wrapped in a drenching solitude, and after all these years, you do. Maybe today you'll make another memory like that. Maybe it'll be the pelicans and their orderly, untalkative lineup in the sky with wings practicing the language of knives. Maybe it'll be the man shrimping, a silhouette on the horizon at sunset, flinging his circular net up into the air to flash a dainty daytime fireworks before it sinks into the sea. Maybe it won't be today. Maybe tomorrow, an even better day, the brassy moon setting as you rise. maybe bouncing a bit before it slips blissfully into the ocean, the Indian Ocean, of course, and overhead, the fabulous wingspan of new birds hungry for the blue horizon. This poem. The snapping. This poem, I sort of feel like I hand it to you, and I just want to say, see? See what I mean? I do think, I've been talking to my workshop a lot. I've been handing out model poems as basically examples of the prompt I've been giving them, because we're doing a generative workshop. And I think poets are wonderful teachers, and poems are better teachers. And this poem, I think, is a good teacher. And for me, it's been a good teacher thinking about using anaphora in a poem, and thinking about using supposition in a poem. Maybe today, maybe not today. Thinking about using different rhetorical structures and making and then breaking the reader's expectations, so that if we get too comfortable with long lines and lots of commas and that kind of syntax, then she'll turn and give us something kind of short. I think about this short line in the beginning of the poem, or about a third of the way through. Why not make today the day you look? And I'm so type A. If you look up a little bit above, a little like first love, maybe today, there are a couple of lines that are sort of feel clipped. Mm-hmm. They're shorter than the other ones. And I've been telling my workshop this too. I'm learning to sort of loosen my grip on my poems and not get out the ruler and say, well, the first 4 lines are all at about a 6 on the word ruler. So I probably shouldn't wade any deeper than that, or I need to stay there. Like I need to extend this line to make sure it lives where the other lines live. Or, well, most of these sentences have been set up like this, and the address has sounded like this, so I probably should keep doing that. But I think the power in the poem is actually making our expectations and then breaking them. I don't even have to tell you how amazing the metaphor is in this poem, or the imagery in this poem. One thing I want to say about it is that it's a mark of a really fabulous poem to me if there are multiple places where it could end and it would be a killer ending. I think sometimes we want a killer ending so much we funnel our poems toward that last line that we come up with, or we think, oh, that's the image, and then we have to sort of reverse engineer the poem to get ourselves to that last line. And actually the bottom of the first page could be a beautiful ending of a poem. And what kind of ear it would take to hear it. Yeah. And every time I turn the page in this book, I think, but wait, there's more. And in fact, the next stanza is, but now, maybe it is noon, maybe today, and then again, using that anaphora but twisting it, maybe it won't be today. And the final image, I don't know, to me it's just so hopeful. To be hungry for the blue horizon is to sort of be looking toward the future. And there's something sort of ecstatic about that I think we get in the title of the poem, Rhapsody Today. As far as permission, I've been thinking about permission and consent since Adrian's craft talk, and I think poems can give us permission to try new things in our work. And this poem, because I came to it so late, it's been giving me permission to not break my poems into stanzas and to collapse the white space and to write a longer, more jagged line. So this poem has been a teacher for me as I write the next thing. I think that's all I'll say.
East Palm Beach. It's good to see you. Thanks for staying with us for this, and thanks for sharing your energy. I found this poem after I figured out what I wanted a poem to do, so I wanted to talk a little bit about what I want a poem to do, and then I'll read the poem so you can see that you will have seen it anyway, but I want to give you a little definition, right? In my mind, the best poems always take me someplace that I've never been, and they show me something that I didn't understand. That's pretty simple, right? But to do that in a space that is deeply familiar to me is an even more transformative poem. And so if you can, just for a second, remind yourself of what it's like to come into the kitchen and see a roach running across the floor. If you've not had that experience, you're lucky, or you've never lived in Texas. And so feel that for a moment, right? The best poems have images. The images push the poem forward. The best poems make statements that are irrefutable, and those statements push the poem forward. I was lucky enough to study with Thomas Lux when I was an undergraduate, and he told us that he believed that every line in a poem should be better than the line that preceded it. And my 20-year-old self was shook by that idea because I imagined it meant that every line was supposed to be bigger or more powerful or, somehow more imagistically solvent than the one, but that's not what he was saying. Right? He was saying that every line should be better than one that came before it because it has all the lines that came before it to give it strength. So each line should be building, and if it's not building, it shouldn't be there. I've only read a few poems even my favorite poems, only a few poems in which every line mattered equally, and this is one of them, and that's why I wanted to talk with you about it. Every line does something, and every line pushes the poem forward, right? So this is from a book called Next. It didn't have a title, so in the table of contents, it's just called Cruelty. I'm going to read it twice because it's little. Cruelty. Don't talk to me about cruelty or what I am capable of. When I wanted the roaches dead, I wanted them dead, and I killed them. I took a broom to their country, and I smashed and sliced without warning, without stopping, and I smiled all the time I was doing it. It was a holocaust of roaches, bodies, parts of bodies, red all over the ground. I didn't ask their names. They had no names worth knowing. Now I watch myself whenever I enter a room. I never know what I might do. So hear it again now that you understand, and notice, if you will, how every line builds on the one before it, and how each line, whether it's a statement, image, or revelation, increases the tension of the poem until we get to that ending that's just one of my favorites. Cruelty. Don't talk to me about cruelty or what I am capable of. When I wanted the roaches dead, I wanted them dead, and I killed them. I took a broom to their country and smashed and sliced without warning, without stopping, and I smiled all the time I was doing it. It was a holocaust of roaches, bodies, parts of bodies, red all over the ground. I didn't ask their names. They had no names worth knowing. Now I watch myself whenever I enter a room. I never know what I might do. So much to that, So if you don't know Lucille Clifton's work, you've got to start now, and you need to do the rest of the work yourselves. I think that she is, even as she is being received and read now, is never going to be received and read with the kind of vigor and enthusiasm she deserves. Her work is so potent. And when I was poet laureate of the great state of Indiana, I brought this poem, written by this beautiful black woman, to some of the most homogenous spaces in my very complicated racial state. And people received it. They heard it. They knew what she was talking about. Some things are bigger than all of that, right? So notice, again, how each line builds. Don't talk to me about cruelty or what I'm capable of. When I wanted the roaches dead, I wanted them dead. We go from one place, being introduced to the speaker and what her concerns are, to the space in which she's having those concerns. And if anybody in here, and again, if you haven't, good for you, but when I was a kid, there were roaches all over the place. And when you'd see them, and you know the rule, if you see one, there's like 50 more right behind it. So the idea that somehow, when you see it, it's a kind of anger. When I wanted them dead, so I killed them. This just reminded me that there's also a sister poem to this called At Last We Killed the Roaches. It's not in Next, it's in a different book. But in that poem, the speaker and her mother finally get rid of all of them, and just for a moment, everything is clean. So imagine these two in conversation. I took a broom to their country and I smashed and sliced without warning, without stopping, and I smiled all the while I was doing it. So we're talking about the rhetoric of the poem, which pushes it forward, line after line, but also the sounds. You see all those S sounds? You see all of those I's and O's. And if you aren't used to scanning poems this way, if you look at a poem and you see a lot of vowels clustered together in a line, amongst the words, you're probably going to have some assonance or consonants happening. In this case, you get both, smashed and sliced without warning, without stopping, all those O's lining up and making that great music, right? Every line has that, but that's the line in which the music really picks up because the action picks up. You can go on, every line gives us something more. She does this incredible thing of turning the word Holocaust, lowercase h, into something that describes these roaches and also sets up the much bigger metaphor of the poem, right? This poem isn't about roaches at all, It never is, right? It's never about that whatsoever. I heard a recording of her from 1983, and she replaced Holocaust with Lebanon.
Ooh.
And you see, that's why everybody should be reading Lucille Clifton. One more thing, because I know that we're on a timer right now. They had no names worth knowing. All of this action, all of this violence gives the speaker this incredible realization at the end. And if you take that, it's almost the opposite in some ways of what Maggie was talking about how some poems have multiple endings and they're so amazing. This ending, if you take it out, this last couplet, it doesn't really do a lot of work. It's just, now I watch myself whenever I'm in a room. I like that a lot. I never know what I might do. I like that a lot. But when you have the previous 5 couplets leading up to that, explaining why this realization happens, all of the sudden the ending is like getting punched in the forehead. You can earn an ending, and that one is the most earned of endings that I could find. I think that's probably enough, but please go read more Lucille Clifton, everybody. It's worth it. Thanks.
Okay, oh yeah, hello. Thanks for being here, especially if you've been here all week long.
Holding it down.
All right, poetry is an endurance machine. Okay, so I have brought you a poem by a poet that not many people know about. Burt Myers was a Los Angeles-based poet. He died in 1979. There's people talk a lot about Sylvia Plath's capacity with image, and she is just an amazing master craftsperson when it comes to the creation of image and visual metaphor. And I think Burt Myers is right there with her. Both of them are lodestars for me, and were lodestars for me as a young woman as I was learning how to write poems. Burt came into my ken because I went to Pitzer College, which is part of the Claremont Colleges in Southern California, and he had had a position there as a poet in residence. And there was a house on campus called the Grove House, which was this old craftsmanship style house that had beautiful, woodwork and everything that had been slated for demolition. And a professor, I don't know how he made this happen, Barry Sanders, but he got Pitzer to buy this house, and they moved it from Pomona, a nearby city, and there was a parade for it. They moved this entire house over to the Pitzer campus and laid the foundation and put it there, and it turned into this beautiful student center. And what would have been the master bedroom, they called the Burt Myers Poetry Room. And I set up shop in there. In fact, I set up so much shop in there, I slept there. You know, in retrospect, like cleaning people would come in the morning and they'd be looking at me like, at some point I got a message from the dean of students. But before that happened, there was like a sleeping porch that I would go and I'd sleep in my sleeping bag. And I mean, I lived in this room and there was this giant portrait of Burt that was on the wall. And Burt was a poet that was taught to me in my classes because I started Pitzer in 1984 and Burt had died 5 years earlier and there were people who remembered working with him and he was just an indelible presence. So this poem is called After the Meal, and what I want you to notice is just the incredible, vivid precision of his transfiguring mind as the speaker of this poem is sitting looking at a table after a meal. A suburb of coffee cups, napkins, those crumpled hills, silverware, freeways spotted with grease, with flesh, and the ashtray, a ghetto full of charred men with grizzled heads who wasted their flame, where every breath scatters its bones and small gray mounds accumulate, then crumble like nations or the knees of elephants. Like a cleaning plant, steam comes through a hole in your face. Your exhaust is the last wild horse that gallops away. Smoke waters the flowers that grow in the lungs. The cigarette, like your life, is a piece of chalk that shrinks as it tries to explain. The thing about that last stanza that also makes it so poignant is Burt was a terrible chain smoker. And this was in the age where you could still smoke anywhere. You could smoke in the classroom, you could smoke in a restaurant. He died of lung cancer. And he was also a master gilder. He had apprenticed and gone through the whole process of learning how to gild frames and wood and all this kind of stuff. And a component of the lung cancer was how much gold dust he had breathed in. And I mean, it's tragic, but it's also like, what a way for a poet to go. I mean, I breathed in gold dust. Anyway, that last stanza because I think it is such an incredible evocation of tumors. Smoke waters the flowers that grow in the lungs. The cigarette, like your life, is a piece of chalk that shrinks as it tries to explain. And the thing about this poem is that there's never a moment where Burt says, I'm dying of cancer. There's never a moment in here that says anything personal about him. It is all just focused on the object and the various objects that come through. And some of you may be familiar with T.S. Eliot's idea about the objective correlative, which is a fancy name for kind of show, don't tell. But you know, what Eliot was getting at was that sometimes when you want to write about something that has a tremendous emotional charge for you, you're going to write a shitty poem, right? I don't know if this has ever happened to you, where you want to write about something that really means something to you, and it's like, nope, nope, nope. So, you know, Eliot said, don't attack the feeling or situation directly. Find an object that is related to that feeling or that situation. And in engaging that object, all of the feelings that you are trying to get on the page will just kind of automatically start to flow. So the other thing about this poem that always makes a big impression on me is sadness doesn't feel exactly like the right word, because there's acceptance in here. There's a cool analytical eye that is responding to the situation, but there is a kind of sorrow, wistfulness. Wistfulness. Like, anybody have a word? What's that? Resignation. What else? I don't know what else you would say. Anybody got an idea? but it has that quality of some
bittersweetness.
Bittersweetness.
Poignancy.
Yeah, poignancy. Thank you, David Kirby. But there is this kind of, like if sadness was the title for a constellation of nuances of feeling, this whole poem kind of offers up that tone, but it's really under here, right? Because what you're really focusing in on are these just the incredible image making. I really encourage you to read Burt Myers. There is a collected that came out. It is available. It's called In a Dybbuk's Raincoat, and I will spell Dybbuk', In a Dybbuk's Raincoat. A Dybbuk is a kind of demon in Jewish mythology. Burt, his poems just meant so much to me as a college student. I just learned so much about what a precision of image can do for a poem, and also that by writing through images, you can express a tremendous array of feeling and situation. I tried to get the Poetry Foundation to give Burt a page. There is a bio up there, but there's no poems, so I got to find out like what happened. His wife was notoriously stingy with rights, and I'm hoping maybe this has eased up. Anyway, this is Burt Myers' poem. Please read more of him. I just want to say one thing I forgot. I'm so sorry. If you teach, he is an excellent poet to teach beginning students. So I really encourage that too.
If masked men burst into my bedroom and said, David Kirby, what's your favorite poem? They wouldn't even have to finish their sentence. They'd say, David Kirby, what's your fave? And I'd jump out of bed and say, Oh, do a Nightingale, Oh, do a Nightingale. John Keats, Don't Shoot. He's good, it's a good one. He wrote a lot, but that's the best. Don't Shoot. But it would take all of my time up here to read that poem. So I didn't bring that one. I almost chose Reginald Dwayne Bett's poem, Blood History. Do you know that poem? Blood History. It's the one in which he says a guy is teasing him and saying, have you ever longed for a father? And the speaker in the poem says, if he had said, have you ever wanted a father? I would have, been like a guy among guys and said, no, man, that didn't bother me one bit. But when he used the word longed for, it said, it just brought out everything in the speaker, and they talked about missing fathers and missing fathers forever. So it's a great poem to look at for picking the exact word. But Reginald's getting a lot of attention these days. So I figured I'd just see if I could find somebody who that is maybe not at all in the spotlight. I write about music when I'm not writing poetry. I write about music and go to shows and panels and talk to people. And not long back, I was at a show that had a bunch of Muscle Shoals musicians, those people from that little studio in Alabama where the great rhythm and blues people recorded, and they were so good that the Rolling Stones, a lot of English groups, came to this little, one stoplight town to make this beautiful music. And it's not doing it at that level anymore, but they still perform, and there are musicians. And somebody asked a Muscle Shoals guitarist, they said, who's your biggest influence? And he said, the guy standing next to me in the studio that day. And I thought, no, that sounds just about right, doesn't it? You think you know everything, and then you run across somebody and they show you a new trick. So I'm going to read this poem that I brought for you called "I Call My Mother Once a Week" by Richard Jones. My mother lives in a land of disaster and tragedy. Yesterday on the phone she said, look, a small white plane just crashed in the yard. Good thing it didn't land on the house, I said, not knowing what to say. It was like the time she'd said, a house down the street burned to the ground, and I'd said, you're kidding. And she said, it was an inferno, and then asked, because I know about words, whether she had used the right one. I said inferno was exactly right, and she added that it was night, pitch black, and the young family of 4 had died in the fire. They couldn't be saved, I said. They couldn't be found, she said. And in the silence on the phone, we could almost hear the flames. To change the subject, I inquired about her crazy friend, Nancy. Nancy was always up to something. Arrested for murder, my mother said. What? I said. She hired a hitman to kill the wife of the man she wants to marry. The tragedy is the man didn't even really know Nancy. Of course, there's nothing to say in response to a story like that. So I just said, sounds like true love. And my mother said, it does, doesn't it? You know? It's a poem of direct conversation. The speaker throws in all of his little thoughts. Well, I didn't know what to say then, or so I said this. So they're really, three speakers: the speaker, speaking speaker, thinking about what he's saying, and the mom. So it's simple. There's a lot of mayhem and bloodshed in the middle of it, but there's a little candy coating of wit. The late English writer and poet and essayist Clive James said, sense of humor is just common sense. Those who lack humor are without judgment and should be trusted with nothing. So even though there's a lot of fire and smoke and plane crashes and burning houses here, there's that extra dimension of wit that makes it all not only palatable, but brilliant in its way. So for the next 24 hours, this is going to be my favorite poem. By the way, I was writing that down just before we began, and Ilya pointed at the word 24, and he said, "Are you sure?" And I said, "Well, maybe 12 hours, but it depends. It depends on how much poetry I'm exposed to between now and then." By the way, I don't want you to be accusing me of momism. I'm not a momist. Moms often appear sort of ditzy in stories and poems, and dads, if they appear at all, appear sort of they're out in the wood shop or sipping some scotch while sorting nails or something like that. But moms are always saying things, and that's a mom's job. A mom's job is to love you unconditionally, and your job is not to judge her. Your mother gets to say what she wants to say, and it's often pretty unfiltered. So this probably sounds either like a mom you have or a mom you wish you had. That's and a lot of people say, "Oh, do this, do that, read more Richard Jones. He has a book called so and so." I got to dig him up. Pay attention. Don't get your phones out and start Googling. But when I get home, I'm going to find out and read more about Richard Jones because I just discovered him.
Thank you so much, all of you, for these wonderful poems and for sharing them. And thank you, David, for giving me permission for saying that, if you have a favorite poem, every time we read a poem that makes us stop and think and breathe, or stop breathing. What I'm interested in is poetry that changes me as a person, that challenges my sensibility, changes my relationship to language. So I'm going to ask you, what is your relationship to English language, your personal? Close your eyes. Come on, close them. Close them. And think about the first sounds of English you ever made. How you played with sounds, how sounds played with you. When did you start organizing sounds into sentences? What emotions did you have when you organized sounds into sentences? And now ask yourself, how and why do you speak in proper sentences now? How does history or country shape our language? And how does our language shape us? And how we in turn shape our country and our history? Do these rules of grammar express who we are? I got a bottle of water here. In English, it's probably the only one way, or maybe one or two or three ways to say I got a bottle of water here in that order. In Russian, I can say got a bottle of water here, here, water bottle got here, water bottle, and it still makes sense. And fully, completely grammatically correct. In the time of William Shakespeare, say, which is not a very long time ago, you could still play quite a bit with the order of language on the page and emotions that was called up in that order. I'm interested what happens when we don't march like this in our sentences, but move slightly differently. What happens when poetry becomes a speech that is liberated from language? This is a poem by Emner B.S. Phillip, a poet who was born in Trinidad and Tobago and lives in Canada now. It's actually a part from a Marshall Launder poem, which would take probably an hour to recite and discuss. And I'm going to read and I'm going to talk and probably read again. Emner B.S. Phillip, from the Discourse and the Logic of Language. English is my mother tongue. A mother tongue is not a foreign language, a foreign anguish. Think what happens from the fact of the first couplet to the twitch inside that fact in the last line. How is that speech liberated from language? She's an innovative poet, and when I started this, I said that I'm interested in poetry that challenges me. And what is that challenges my sensibility, that changes my sensibility, changes me. And what she does here is she uses innovative language for a reason. Not just she wants to play with it and she wants to look cool, but she has a deep reason for changing the language. There's a real emotion that goes hand in hand with the music. Eliot is known for saying poetry is communicated before it's understood. And you can hear that in the music as well. Of course, it's a poem about us, our moment in time. It is also a poem where it's not just about an information. Poem is not about an event, it becomes an event. It becomes the change it speaks about. Finally, I want to end on a quote from a well-known Polish poet, speaking of Herbert. Since we are living in a specific moment in time right now, and he said that a poet is like a barometer. A poet doesn't change the weather. A poet tells us what the weather is like. And this poem tells me what the weather is like. English is my mother tongue. A mother tongue is not a foreign language, anguish, a foreign anguish. Thank you.
Hi. It is just such a joy to be here because I imagine, like many of you, when I read something I love, all I want to do is share it with other people. And I kind of get that sense from all of you. And my wife says I have a tendency to evangelize. So instead of just beloved poems, I think of this as the Have You Heard the Good Word panel. So I would like to bring you over to Jane Mead, so we can take a look at her. As you were both saying, I mean, there were so many poems I could have brought, so many poets I would love to share with you and bring your attention to. But one, I have been working on a collection of spiritually engaged poems, and the poet who most helps me get started in the morning. The poet I like to read is Jane Mead. And oftentimes I'll do that when there's a particular thing I want to write about. I will pick a poet who does that exceptionally well. And then I feel like when I read that poem often aloud, it lets me feel that I am entering into conversation with that poet. And I think that as writers, that's what we are all doing. So that's one reason, but also Jane Mead was lost to cancer last September at the age of only 61. So I just want to make sure, do a small part to make sure that her words continue long beyond her. So we're going to be looking together at a poem that is the last poem in her very first collection, which is called The Lord and the General Din of the World. She's really good at titles. You're going to see that in a second. Before we read the poem, though, I want to just give you a little bit of context. I'm really interested when I read a collection in how it's organized. I'm interested especially in what is the first poem and what is the last poem, right? Because the first poem, in a way, is kind of like the front door of a house. And you want to think about, does it welcome you in? Does it open into a space that makes you feel like you want to venture in further? Or is it a space that feels confining and in some way shuts you out? So in this collection, the first poem is titled, Concerning That Prayer I Cannot Make. Concerning That Prayer I Cannot Make. And this is a title that does so much work because it speaks simultaneously of longing, I want to pray, and failure, and yet I cannot. There's also the intimacy of not just concerning the prayer, concerning that prayer, where she trusts that even though she cannot say the words that she needs, that omniscient being who she is trying to speak to will somehow know which prayer it is that she's trying to make. So the poem goes on from the title. The speaker goes and sits beside a river and watches all of the clouds kind of flowing under this rusted out bridge and watches the water, but she also watches the trash floating along the river, right? She notices everything. And then she comes to this line, and it's this line that a lot of times when I'm just, I'm feeling a little bit broken, right? And I need my own kind of prayer. It is like this little prayer in the middle of this poem. I am not equal to my longing. It's so beautiful. I am not equal to my longing. And then she goes on, and this is how the poem ends. Listen. All you bare trees, burrs, brambles, pile of twigs, red and green lights flashing, muddy bottle shards, shoe half buried. Listen, listen, I am holy. So the front door to this collection, the one that invites you in, is one of longing and a desperate searching after prayer, and there's also a failure in that searching. But it coheres into an insistence that despite this, the speaker is holy, right? Or perhaps because of that failure, because of the fact that she has to go on searching, she is holy. So this poem that we're going to look at together is then the final poem in the collection. Passing a truck full of chickens at night on Highway 80. What struck me first was their panic. Some were pulled by the wind from moving to the ends of the stacked cages. Some had their heads blown through the bars and could not get them in again. Some hung there like that, dead. Their own feathers blowing, clotting in their faces. Then I saw the one that made me slow some. I lingered there beside her for 5 miles. She had pushed her head through the space between bars to get a better view. She had the look of a dog in the back of a pickup, that eager look of a dog who knows she's being taken along. She craned her neck. She looked around, watched me, then strained to see over the car, strained to see what happened beyond. That is the chicken I want to be. Yeah, it's a good one. So again, we get that particular that, right, which is also in the opening poem to this collection. So in a way, it's a beautiful response to the poem's opening call. Instead of trash racing past on a river, here we have chickens racing past on a highway. Right? And then it gives into this fully realized moment. We get the full scene. The title does the work. She doesn't have to say, I was on a highway and there was this truck and this thing happened. Right? The title does all of that work, which then lets her dive into the concrete details of this very painful scene. And, you know, Nickole and I travel a lot, and it made me think of all of the times in the Midwest when I have been passed by a truck like this. And I have, you know, tried not to breathe in because I didn't want to smell that. And I've often tried not to look because it's so painful. But Jane Mead is not just a poet who looked, right? Jane was a poet who slowed for 5 miles because she wanted to take all of that in. And because of that, we get the details that let this scene be both something very real, right? But it also becomes a really powerful metaphor. And to me, what this poem is saying is that this is the human condition, right? In a way, we are all these chickens along for this ride, whether we want to be or not, and to this mortal destination, right? We are going along, and some of us are deadened by the terror, by the rush, right? We're kind of half dead already. And some of us are that one chicken who's insisting that, yes, she wants to see it all, right? Despite where she's going, she is going to be present to the world. So if you think of that first poem as an opening insistence on holiness, a searching after prayer, in a way, this final poem opens out, right? That is the chicken I want to be. It lets us step back into our lives, changed by this insistence on awareness and this love for the world. So, thank you.
It also ends the way Maggie's poem does, right? Looking out.
Yeah.
It's a good trick.
Who is that chicken? Raise your hands.
We can try to be the chicken.
Good afternoon. I'm happy to be part of this panel. Teaching for me is over 14 weeks particularly becomes an exercise in matchmaking poems, finding poems to hopefully students would get turned on by and enter into this life of exploring, testing language to give some sort of texture to their own particular lives. And being on a panel like this feels like speed dating, and I'm happy to I start with teaching because I have this thing about with my students that if I recite more poems than they do as a class, then from memory, then the highest grade they can get is a C. And I normally start with this particular poem at the beginning of the year for a number of reasons. This poem, Venus's Flytrap, has long worked its charms on me since I first discovered it in Yusuf's book, Magic City, published in 1994. It's the opening poem to that collection, mainly about his childhood in Bogalusa, Louisiana. And the poem sets off a chain of poems in that book that recalls the landscape of the South, the landscape of his youth, the natural world, that which has given psychic foundation to his existence as a man. And I think about the number of poems that do that. Youth and childhood is one of the great subjects, and one of the notes that hits quite often comes from Wordsworth. This idea that the girl is mother to the woman, or the boy is father to the man. There's something about compelling here for me, the means by which Yusef enters into a child's mind and renders that voice quite believable. In giving us this particular consciousness, there's an amazing amount of transport that has to happen, that he has to enter into. I also read this poem at dinner parties. This is a great dinner party poem, and I think everyone should have a dinner party poem. Wonderful of convincing in-laws that their son or daughter has made the right choice. The other reason why I turn to poems also because not only do I want a fresh experience with language that is going to help me see and experience the world differently, but somehow kind of reorders my consciousness. And increasingly, I'm drawn to poems that experiment with logic or the illogic. And in this particular case, this is one of those lyric poems that has a speed and velocity of seeing and association, even as it's held together by the spine of this child's voice, which might be one of the great achievements of this voice. I'm doing a lot of talking now so that you don't, so that I'm gonna read it in the end and that'll be it. But I just want to say that achievement of voice is one of the great accomplishments of poetry. Anyone who has edited poetry or even read journals, maybe one of the critiques that we hear is that so many poems sound alike. And I know a poem is memorable when not only it achieved voice, but it flashes a spotlight into some area of human existence that I have experienced or had not experienced, but deemed worthy. Think about, for a second, the 5-year-olds that you know. Think about their inquisitiveness. Think about their precociousness. Think about even your own selves before the routines of life pushed you further and further away from that spirit of wonderment that we all have as kids. Venus's Flytrap. I'm going to ask you not to read, but maybe read with your ears. I am 5, wading out into deep sunny grass, unmindful of snakes and yellow jackets, out to the yellow flowers quivering in sluggish heat. Don't mess with me, 'cause I have my Lone Ranger 6-shooter. I can hurt you with questions like silver bullets. The tall flowers of my dreams are big as the First State Bank, and they eat all the people except the ones I love. They have women's names with mouths like where babies come from. I am 5, I'll dance for you if you close your eyes, no peeping through your fingers. I don't suppose to be this close to the tracks. One afternoon I saw what a train did to a cow. Sometimes I stand so close I can see the eyes of men hiding in boxcars. Sometimes they wave and holler for me to get back. I laugh when trains make the dogs howl, their ears hurt. I also know bees can't live without flowers. I wonder why Daddy calls Mama honey. All the bees in the world live in little white houses, except the ones in these flowers, all sticky and sweet inside. I wonder what death tastes like. Sometimes I toss the butterflies back into the air. I wish I knew why the music in my head makes me scared, but I know things I don't suppose to know. I could start walking and never stop. These yellow flowers go on forever, almost to Detroit, almost to the sea. My mama says I'm a mistake, that I made her a bad girl. My house, my playhouse is underneath our house, and I hear people telling each other secrets. Thank you.
Wait a minute. Major, did you actually say you read poems at dinner parties?
Yes.
I loved that. You want to come over and read? That's amazing. Your dinner parties are so much better than mine.
We can host one together.
One of the poems in Gwendolyn Brooks's second book, Annie Allen, which was published in 1949, and that's the one that won the Pulitzer Prize, is a group of 3 sonnets, a sequence of 3 sonnets called Children of the Poor. We talk about how a poet like Gwendolyn Brooks, well, there is no other poet like Gwendolyn Brooks, so let me take that part back. But a poet who tries to do something like what she does in many poems is attempting to humanize, that's a word we use, the neglected, rejected, and subjected among us. But the word's just too vague to suggest what she actually makes happen. She offers her psyche, her selfhood, some sort of a commitment of being that is in the language, that's living in the language, to what is most in need of that kind of attention. I'm going to read the second sonnet. There's so much in this poem, not only the children of the poor, but also her stance toward them, and her stance, she's thinking also about what it takes to be an artist who wants to make real experience that most people look away from. And even a great poem cannot save anyone in itself. It can say something of them, though. It can say, look, see this, and sense the difficulty and the necessity of trying to articulate it. The poem almost feels like it's trying for us to show us how it's trying. What shall I give my children who are poor, who are adjudged the least wise of the land, who are my sweetest lepers, who demand no velvet and no velvety velour, but who have begged me for a brisk contour, crying that they are quasi-contraband, because unfinished, graven by a hand less than angelic, admirable, or sure. My hand is stuffed with mode, design, device, but I lack access to my proper stone. And plenitude of plan shall not suffice, nor grief, nor love shall be enough alone to ratify my little halves who bear across an autumn freezing everywhere. Now, I just want to say a couple of things more about it. The poet is a sculptor of language. I lack access to my proper stone. What kind of language, how can I get hold of that marble that would allow me to sculpt this? And yet at the same time, then she shifts and says, the children are crying that they are quasi-contraband because unfinished, unfulfilled in their living, unable to attain what should be for them. And graven, she says, by hand, less than angelic, admirable, or sure. That suggests an etching, but it also has the word grave in it. So in a way, she's talking about the difficulty of saying what she's trying to find a way to say. And the first poem and the first and the third sonnet, of course, add an enormous amount to this poem. But I could talk for a long time about any one of them. But this is the one that stays in my head. This particular one of the three. I think about it all the time.
So back when I taught at the University of Arkansas and had a proper teaching job with a proper office, with my proper office hours, I would often sit there at my desk and I'm sure a lot of you who teach know this, your students come by and boy, they bring you all kinds of stuff. And I had a box of Kleenex ready, right? You just never know. And after teaching there for about a year, I went out and got myself a little faux prescription pad where a student would come in and talk to me and I would say, Patricia Smith. Write it down. Here's what you got to do. Laure-Anne Bosselaar, take 2 Ross Gays and call me in the morning, kid. You know, it's going to be okay. And so the poem I want to share with you today isn't necessarily a poem about how to write, but at least for me is sort of the good medicine that I needed. And it's been interesting watching everybody go down the line because I'm sure a lot of you who read, you're like, oh, that poem and that poem and that poem, right? And I have so many. But this is a poem by Tracy Brimhall. She was here a few years ago. She's incredible. And this is from her first book called Rookery. And I'll read it for you and then just tell you how that poem is working its particular kind of alchemy on me and not necessarily, again, teaching me how to write, but how to live. So, prayer for sunlight and hunger. On my birthday, my grandmother announces the angels are upstairs sharpening their wings, preparing for war. We must ready ourselves for the Messiah's return when he will ride out of the sky in all his terrible splendor to destroy us. We must watch the moon, the pale harbinger of resurrection, for signs. She has warned us since childhood. In the years past and past and past as the abacus slid beads toward the apocalypse. Every Sabbath we grow lunar, delirious, waiting for the eclipse. And every year I dread the messengers coming like the 2 strange angels who come to me in dreams, put their hands on my shoulders and say, behold what you are, a cardinal in snow, fog in the trees at dawn, a lamb bringing a dead shepherd a crown of thistles. But tonight, we toast to salvation and pray for another year of needs and mistakes. My Lord, my heart is insatiable. Leave me here among the ordinary wonders. I would miss the sound of birds under my window in the morning singing about sunlight and hunger. I would miss the smell of bread rising and dancing barefoot to the silence while my lover sleeps. I want to eat the pound cake and peaches on my plate and hug my mother so I can smell the powder on her neck. I want to pick wild blueberries, to swim in 3 oceans, to see an avalanche from a distance and have terror bring my soul to the surface of my body. Loneliness is the worst kind of freedom. And I'm full of gratitude for the man who kissed me against a brick wall, for the man who pulled back my hair and whispered to my clavicles, and for the one who read me Ovid as I undressed. I know there is a beauty we must die to reach, but I have come this far, and there are crumbs on the table and wine in my glass. The moon is full, and tonight the sky looks wide, wild, and endless. And so, for those of you, of course, who have been to my craft talk and my reading, you'll know that I'm deeply concerned with what could be seen as the end of our world. And of course, it's not, quote unquote, the end times as described here in this poem with the angels sharpening their wings and the Messiah's return, but it's definitely an end that began for me a few years ago, where I live in the Carolinas, when yet another hurricane flooded. And when that water pulled back, it had gone so far inland, millions upon millions upon millions of chickens had drowned, mostly in, of course, factory farms. And there were so many fish left on the highway, a lot of them from the ocean. They were stranded out in the ocean. They had to take fire hoses and blast all of that debris, all of that stench away with even more water. And that was also the same time, shortly thereafter, Jesse and I had Thanksgiving at our house, where we too read poems at Thanksgiving. So it's a good thing. I want to come to your house for dinner. But I had a friend of mine, a writer. She leaned over and she said to me, "It's already happened." And I said, "What, honey? What's already happened?" And she said, "The apocalypse. It's already come and it's already gone, and we haven't even felt the shortages yet." And I was like, "Oof, okay, right?" You know, and I've held on to that moment ever since, thinking, just what to do with that. And what's the interesting thing about Tracy's poem here, and she talks about this in a lot of her interviews, is that ever since she was a little girl, her grandmother, instead of sending her a birthday card, would send her an apocalypse card.
Whoa.
So that's what it's made mention in this poem, but I just want you to wrap your mind around that. And so I thought, okay, so if the apocalypse for me has been pressing down for 4 years, for Tracy, it's been pressing down since she was 4, right? So maybe she's got something to teach me. And yes, there's a huge difference between sort of the Pentecostal religious warnings that you're hearing here and climate crisis, but there is something emotionally that's the same with dealing with, is this over? Is this it? Is this the last day? Is this all we get? What do I do? How do I move forward? And I thought, okay, Tracy, what do you got to teach me here? And what I think is really interesting, I wrote her before coming to the festival and asked about this poem, and she said that this particular poem was one in which she tries to have it out with her obsessions, which I love. And she said to try and have one big kablooey, that was her word, one big kablooey to try to make it be over. And she said, of course, things like your childhood and God and desire aren't really obsessions you can get over, but hey, a gal's gotta try. And then she added, wasn't it Yeats that said that the argument with oneself is poetry? And she said, I think that's the deal, trying to face a fear to get the resolutions that I'm able to grant myself, which I thought was just really interesting. And that said, if you look closely at this poem, Tracy does have something to teach all of us, not just about if you think the end times are coming or whether or not the apocalypse is going to happen or has already happened, or if you have cancer and you know you might not make it another month. And that's how to survive dire predictions, how to rise above a howling terror. And that begins, of course, in this poem in the 8th stanza, when she toasts to salvation and she prays for another year of needs and mistakes. And she asks the Lord not to save her, but to leave her among the ordinary wonders, with the birds under her window, singing about sunlight and hunger, which of course is the title of that poem, brings you back to what that prayer is that's being echoed there, right? And then she lists things that she would miss. All of them are so ordinary. The smell of rising bread, the powder on her mother's neck, dancing barefoot, pound cake peaches. And then, of course, she recounts erotic moments for which she's grateful, saying, I know there is a beauty we must die to reach, but I have come this far, and there are crumbs on the table and wine in my glass. And to me, that doesn't speak of hedonism. It's not a call to eat, drink, and be merry for tomorrow we die. I don't think that's what it is at all. I think it's a way in which, one, she's not laughing off her grandmother, right? Because that's a very different poem, but like, my grandmother is crazy, right? We could read that poem and we would accept it. And it's also not one in which she sinks into the darkness, nor does she totally turn away from that darkness and ignore it. What she does instead is she says, okay, maybe this is going to happen. Maybe the moon is going to turn to blood, and here we go, right? But today, right here, right now, I'm going to be alive and full of gratitude and presence and awareness, which I think is so very important. And I think there's a way in which this kind of practice shores up our hearts for whatever end may come to all of us, because everyone will meet some sort of an end. And even more important, which I think is so important for me to hold on to, is how to remember what is worth loving in this world, which will then feed us and nourish us so that we know what is worth fighting for. And so that's my pill that I needed to swallow today, but there are many here. But thank you.
They're like baseball cards. Yeah, you swap and trade them and have a little who's passing this? I think so.
So many of us, I've heard during the conference and also along this table, everybody saying, I'm so glad that we're here. I'm so glad with this week. I'm so glad of having been in this workshop or that workshop. The Barbara Rass poem, the ecstatic, the gratitude, just started trickling down. And here is my heartbeat of gratitude. Tracy Brimhall was a student of mine because I taught at Sarah Lawrence College, where Thomas Lux was the head of the creative writing department. And one day, a gentleman who was over 65, I won't say how much over 65, came and became a student of Thomas Lux. And that man studied for 4 semesters at Sarah Lawrence, and then that man told Thomas Lux, Tom, now I have my effing MFA, because the man I'm talking about loved the word that starts with F, and now I have my effing MFA, and now what do I do? And Thomas Lux told the man, well, you start an effing conference. That man was Miles Kuhn, whose birthday it is today. I also happen to be a student of Thomas Lux. So Tom was a poet of shameless and constant gratitude. And I think that I don't need to say much more. I'd love just to read his poem and remind myself and remind you all that what he kept repeating over and over, and forget again my French here, but it was his French, not mine. Tom kept repeating each image, each line, everything should be an effing metaphor of gratitude to poetry. I decided I was fucking metaphor. So he's not here, but we're going to F and dance with him next year. I want you all to come back so that we can celebrate him. So I'm just going to read the poem. I think that we've said it all, but I'm grateful that you were all here and that I could be part of it. Poem in thanks. Lord, whoever, thank you for this air I'm about to in and exhale. This hutch in the woods, this wood for fire, the light, both lamp and the natural stuff of leafback, fern, and wing. For the piano, the shovel for ashes, the moth-gnawed blankets, the stone cold water, stone cold. Thank you. Thank you, Lord, coming to carry me here, where I'll gnash it out, Lord, where I'll calm and work, Lord. Thank you for the goddamn birds singing.
I guess this would be a good time to thank you all, poets, for not needing moderation. Clearly.
You're welcome.
You're clearly pros who kept to your 10 minutes and gave us all a really big bag of cheese doodles. So this is a packet to keep, right? We're all going to keep this packet. I think we go to the audience now, and there are interns walking around and other people with microphones. So if anybody has a question or wants to share something or ask one of the poets, especially David Kirby, what he meant by that mom job.
You're in trouble, buddy.
I guess.
Hi, this is very prosaic and technical, but in the poem next, were the small lowercase i's a typo or intentional?
Everything's intentional. No, she, as I understand it, Lucille Clifton believed that none of the words were any bigger than the others, especially not the I. And so it's a stylistic thing and also a statement. So yeah, so it shouldn't be in there.
That
That's
was
a typo.
That's
Yeah, the lowercase is what it should be. There should be nothing uppercase.
That's the sixth Marx brother. He's always there. Yeah, typo.
Thank you for asking about that.
That's right.
I'd like to say something to Ilya.
Thank you guys for all that. Really quickly, just whoever wants to respond to this, in addition to the beloved poems that you've shared, are there a particular beloved form that you really find yourself gravitated towards?
I'll answer. This is not any kind of received form, but I really like working modularly, by which I mean I like working in sections. I like working in sections small and large. I like the way that they let me focus in on constituent parts. I like the way in which they allow me to write prismatically and liberate me from having to maintain certain kinds of consistency of pronoun, distance. They really allow for a sort of wilder and more wide-ranging approach. So I find sections very handy and attractive.
I like the form that was standing next to me in the studio that day. I don't know about you, but a few years ago I noticed that I didn't feel the same way about poets that I really had loved for decades. And it kind of bothered me, and I thought there was something wrong with myself. And then, of course, I shifted the blame to them. And what I realized was that these were all good poets writing good poems. The only thing is they were writing the same poem over and over again. So I said, I don't want to do that. And, well, you know, if you've read any of my poems, they tend to be kind of long and loopy, so I started reading a lot of Jack Gilbert. And I'm here to tell you that if the lawyers from the Jack Gilbert estate don't show up and sue me for plagiarism, then they're not keeping an eye on the bottom line, because I just kept writing these things over and over again. I wrote so many Jack Gilberts that you know, I would go in and turn myself into Barbara Hamby and say, Barbara, I keep writing these Jack Gilberts, and she said, well, just keep it up. They'll turn into Dave Kirby poems, and you know, they did, but you know, shaking it up is not the worst thing you can do.
I have a particular love for the pantoum, just because the repetition precedes another repetition that is going to be richer because of the previous repetition, and it grows and grows and grows, and then ends with the first line being the last line of the pantoum. And for some reason, it's an incredible challenge, the form of the pantoum. And I probably keep every 10th pantoum. All the rest go to the trash. But it helps me also to have that sort of heartbeat that comes back and that comes back. And it forces you to think about that image and how you can go deeper and deeper and deeper into what I call the longing for the meaning of the image.
I'll answer that. Because you have a packet of cheese doodles in front of you, one of the forms I found myself working on over the last couple of years is the cento, which is the laziest form. So a cento, C-E-N-T-O, is just a poem where you actually don't write anything, which is why it's the laziest form. You don't write anything, you pull lines from other people's poems and you reassemble them to make your own sort of arc or narrative or meaning. And so for me, it's a great, maybe at the end, say just for example, at the end of a long week where you've been generating a lot of new poems and your brain's a little cooked, it's a good form to go to when you're not feeling particularly inspired either, because you can go to your bookshelf or your library or the internet and find a bunch of poems that you like and find some lines that you like and then think, okay, this line that I love ends with a preposition. So I need to find a line that begins with a noun or a verb phrase that flows from this. And then, oh, the moon comes up here. I wonder if I can find a line in a poem that has something that I could build off of that would work with this moon in this line. And it's collage. I love it.
Yeah, you know, you can actually do that with your own poems, especially failed poems. You know, like create a, is it cento or cento?
I don't know, I guess it's Italian, so maybe.
What is it?
Cento.
Cento. You can create a cento using your own, like especially with failed poems. I construct poems like this all the time. You know, just grabbing lines here and there, but doing exactly what Maggie's talking about in terms of like, oh, this is a preposition. Wow, it really works with this line I could never make work that begins with a noun, kind of a thing.
Cannibalize the self.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's easier when other poets do your writing for you, you know.
Yeah.
Even if the other poet is yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
True.
Yeah.
I like that.
Is it okay if we ask something or not? No, okay.
I want to just take the question a little bit further and talk not just about form, but what makes a form of poem successful. There is a lovely little quote from Tom Gunn, who said, every sonnet is a plot against the sonnet. So, to my mind, it is not just the form, but how you confront it. And just to give you an example, I talked to my students earlier this week in the class. I teach engineers, some of them never took a poetry class, but they're really quick in getting the craft. So something like a famous Villanelle, do not go gentle into that good night, but Dylan Thomas. Yeah. A student raises a hand and says, but without alliteration and assonance in the first line, it would be so goddamn sentimental. Yes!
Yeah.
See what I mean? So what you're using it for, what kind of emotion it's in tension with.
The poem Rhapsody Today reminded me of W.S. Merwin's poem, Anniversary of My Death, which is one of my favorite poems because the poem Anniversary of My Death always reminds me of, I always say to myself, well, today is the day I didn't die. Today is the day I'm alive. Today is the day I'm going to do such and such, even if it's just getting a cup of coffee. But that's one of my very favorite poems, Anniversary of My Death. Today is the day I didn't die. So I felt that Rhapsody Today was, you know, saying it in a different way, but I love Merwin because he goes through the back door. Today, you know, today's the day I didn't die. But thank you very much for sharing.
Thank you. Now I want to look at that one again and see how they are in conversation.
You think there's a trend towards rap poetry? Because every time you go to a reading, it seems to me that rap poetry predominates. And, you know, because there's so much excitement with the story that's being told. And I wonder how you feel about rap poetry, and do you feel that that's kind of a trend?
So Major and I are looking at each other like, which one of us are going to say something about this? I'm really interested in the question. I don't know what rap poetry is exactly. I know that rappers are poets. They're bad poets a lot of times, but they're poets, and that's music.
So are poets.
Yes, poets are bad too. But I don't understand what rap poetry is, so I don't feel like I can answer the question. Major?
Winter evening settles down with smells of steaks and passageways. 6 o'clock, the burnt out ends of smoky days. And now a gusty shower wraps the grimy scraps of withered leaves about your feet and newspapers from vacant lots. That's T.S. Eliot. Wow. That's like, you know, I mean, you see the point I'm making, right? Like, yeah.
How do you all feel about haiku? I love it. What's that? Okay, look, the whole 5-7-5 thing is bullshit. It's just a way to get you to focus on compressed language. The spirit of haiku is the spirit of surprise and juxtaposition. Usually when you read classic haiku, you will notice that you can divide a haiku in two, and it's usually like the first 2 lines rubbing up against the last line, or the first line rubbing up against the last 2 lines. Here's an example. I think this is Isa. A bath when you're born, a bath when you die. How stupid. Okay, so the spirit of haiku is not about getting that 5-7-5 thing down. It's about creating a moment of surprise. It might be quiet, it might be loud. I think a really great haiku should wake me up to something perceptual that I don't often think about. What's the one we walk on the roof of hell gazing at flowers, right? So I think haiku is an amazing form, but to do it well, what you're really working with is juxtaposition and turn, the volta, the turn, the syllable count, whatever. I mean, they need to be short and compressed, but you get what I'm talking about.
You know, there's a great haiku by Etheridge Knight, and it goes, "Making jazz swing in 17 syllables ain't no square poet's job." And I think that there's something to that, right? Because you have to think about the sounds and the meaning and the timing while you're writing it. So.
Yeah. There's also that one, I think it's, poems are fun to write, but a lot of them don't make any sense refrigerator. That's by Anand.
Yeah, there you go.
He's not going to come out saying a lot of things.
He's very prolific.
He's pretty prolific. He's got a lot of them.
I have a question for Ilya. Ilya, right here. Can I ask you two related questions, or just one? Just one, okay. How has your living here in the United States changed the way you view language, culture, history, humor, etc.? Do you need that again?
Living in the U.S., how has it changed your relationship with culture, humor, language?
Well, I didn't write in English in Russia. I did not write in English when I was in Russia. A lot of them changed. I mean, Russian literature is much younger. Alexander Pushkin was writing in 1844. What the hell is 1844 for English literature? So it's a much younger literature, which is not a judgment value. It produced in 1100 writers like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. How do I feel in relationship to language? You see, I have to really ask myself, what is a successful lyric poem for me? And what makes me go back to a specific lyric poem? And because I like a lot of poems, I love a lot of poems, but I don't necessarily have to go back to them. And what makes me go back is a kind of a spell, for the lack of a different word. When we talk in America about the beginnings of poetry, we talk about a blind white male from Greece who told you about war. That is not the only way to begin poetry. There were wailing songs, there were lullabies, there were spells, and that kind of poetry survived to our time as well. Whether or not you believe in Lauren Niedriker or Gerda Stein and Bosselaar or so many other poets, that poetry is very much alive and well. And we don't really talk about poetry this way in this country because we are so goddamn professional. And that is one of our limitations.
I agree.
Yes.
So let's keep the question to the subject matter of the day, and we have time for about 2 more questions.
Hi, it's my first time this year here. I'm a new writer, about 5 years. It came through my awakening. I've been in a lot of spiritual practices for a long time, opening up to the shadows and the configurations of the mind and just growing so beautifully with all of that. I just went to apply to a writing school for my master's in fine arts. I just bought the ticket. I looked at it yesterday. I feel alive here. It feels like everything. It just feels so right to be here. Being with you all inspire me to reframe my poetry, my writing a little bit. I usually just allow it to come through, and it's beautiful, and it's an experience. But I'd like to learn more. I'd like to integrate it and to believe in it so much that it just inspires my life and everybody that reads it. You all resonated with me as I came in. Are you all teachers?
to go back to the first thing out of your mouth, we're all new poets.
Come back to this conference every year because there's different faculty every year, and it builds and builds and builds and builds.
And read.
We all teach, we all teach workshops.
That's it. We're going to say. Okay.
You want to know what?
Well, I wanted to ask because this is something that has been truly an obsession in the last 2-3 years for me. And I wanted to talk about that with you, Ilya. We come from a different language. We are not, English isn't our mother tongue. English is my fourth language. We come from a culture where there are feminine, masculine, and neutral worlds, right? And I was talking about that with Joy Harjo, where for her the moon is masculine, for me the moon is feminine. For her, a branch is feminine, for me a branch is masculine. And how, just because of gender, a whole poem can be changed in its meaning because we have a she as a branch and not an it. And the reason why I'm saying this is because I wonder if in our writing process, we couldn't try to imagine things having a gender in English and giving a more feminine or masculine or the distance of the it to certain things and how that could enrich our writing in English.
You can also expand this conversation to really the whole, you can really expand what you just said to the whole table and to the whole room by saying that what you're really saying is poet doesn't write in a normative language. Poets write in a the project of the empire is to dull the senses. The project of the poet is to wake up the senses.
That's right.
That's a perfect place to stop.
Okay, that's a wrap. Let's have a great hand for these